All right, thanks very much for having me, for the invitation to share a little bit of what's happening at CSU Act Next. Just to get started with this presentation, I know some of you folks will be there, I guess, tomorrow, but also wanted to share a little bit about our facility for folks that haven't been there or won't be able to make it there on Thursday. So where we do most of this work and a lot of the data that I'm going to share is what we call our Climate Smart Research Facility. And this shot on the left is an overhead actually from ZLOC, from a drone shot of kind of the overview of the facility. So we have 6 pens that are set up identically. Each has 5 smart feed units, 1 green feed unit. As I'll share, we run this at a pretty high stocking density, so we can run at 300 animals at any one time if we have the facility completely full. In terms of how this facility is set up, we also have concrete bunks on the side of our smart feed, so we're able to kind of ramp those animals up, acclimate them prior to transitioning to feeding only out of the smart feeds in that facility. Typically, we have a 2-week adaptation. I know this has been something that's come up. For the most part, we've had pretty good luck with our animals adapting fairly quickly to both the green feed and the smart feed. Our only issue is one set of cattle that were temperamentally really probably had just seen humans the first time on foot when they came to our facility, and so that's the only time we've ever had challenges, but otherwise had pretty good luck with getting those animals adapted quickly to both sets of equipment. Our stocking rates are pretty high for our smart feeds. We run 10 animals per bin. For us, it's really key is to do a good job with feed management to make sure that we don't have significant competition issues at running at that high level. In the green feed, we run max 50 per unit in this facility. We have gone above that. Similar discussion when we're especially in more commercial environments and we just have more animals within a paddock in a grazing situation. We have achieved 100% use rate with even that stocking density. Usually, though, in the feedlot, we're somewhere around a 95% usage rate for the green feed itself. I will say also for all these, I mentioned that briefly yesterday for our panel discussion, right? And as I share some of this data, just important context of the settings that we run this these sets of machines at. We set them up so the animals can visit every 4 hours, up to 6 times per day. Our goal with that is to try to get a good distribution across 24 hours to capture that diurnal feeding pattern. In this facility, we're often only feeding 1 time per day. So between our min and our max within a 24-hour period can be 100 gram per head per day flux difference. So we want to make sure that we get a good cross section of that 24-hour subsample. So this facility has been in this current setup since November of 22. And since that time, we've had 16 experiments or feed intake trials that have run through the facility, representing a little over 2,100 animals that are either we have records on or we're currently completing, as you all will see if you go up there tomorrow. We do also have 2 green feed units on trailers for grazing work. And so this is just a picture here of Anna, who's in the back at the Johnny Rouse Ranch, the Beef Improvement Center. So we're even today running some of those units up in Wyoming. So the comment that was made earlier, you don't want to put your units too far away from the office. It's definitely true. Fortunately, we just make Hannah drive 3.5 hours to do all the maintenance on them because it is a lot of maintenance. We have collaborated with USDA ARS a few times to expand our capacity when we're doing grazing trials and we need to have more green feeds for the experimental design setup that we're looking at. Okay, so I'm just going to give a very high-level overview of some of the research that we've done. Hopefully, if you have questions, we can kind of go through more details at the end of this presentation, but just a high-level summary of the research. So for us, as we started collecting some of this data, some of our first questions was this idea of if we are going to use this data for genetic selection, and again, this is more where we turn to our collaborators at CSU to help us with that, but we wanted to know how many visits should we have from these devices to get a quote-unquote good phenotype, right? And that's one of those discussion points that's come up again and again of just what does that even mean and how should we think about that when we do have variation of methane emissions over an animal's life, depending upon environment, etc. So for us, that was a key first investigation. And so our approach, we honestly built upon the work from Megan Rolfe's group, that Dressler 2023 publication of thinking about how many spot samples does one need over time to try to get some sort of convergence upon a mean compared to some sort of gold standard test period length, right? And one note, that's kind of an arbitrary thing, right? What should the test period length be from a gold standard, if you will? For us, what we ended up selecting was animals that had at least 100 visits or more, right? And comparing it back to that average that we would get from those 100 visits. So in our approach on this, we took 3 different experiments that we had collected at that time, pooled this data together, and said, looking at these animals, whoever met that criteria of having at least 100 visits, looking at how their mean methane emissions compared in 5 visit intervals, right? So the first 5 visits, first 10, 15, going forwards and backwards over the measurement period, and looking at, for us, as we'll share on the next slide, the Pearson correlation coefficients, the Spearman rank correlation coefficients, but also thinking about the residual variance, how that changed, and the repeatability over that increasing number of visits. We also looked at this as the question of, should we do 2-minute or greater visits or 3-minute or greater visits, right? Because there's some discussion about that in the literature as well. Different folks have different approaches and how they look at that. So this is really the takeaway for methane for this data set and this analysis. So on the left-hand side, we have our visits that are 2-minute or greater. And then on the right-hand side, 3 minutes or greater. And again, this is just showing the forward ranges of, again, those ranges at the bottom are the first 5 visits, first 10, 15, etc., all the way to the 100 visit average. The dotted line is the Spearman rank correlation coefficient, and the dashed black line is the Pearson correlation coefficient, and then in green is the residual variance, which we can see drops pretty significantly as we move forward with the number of visits that we have. If we set a threshold at that 0.95 of both the Spearman rank and the Pearson correlation coefficient, what we've kind of used as a standard going forward, and repeated this a few times in other data sets, is about 55 visits. We feel good from that standpoint of hitting that level of correlation, right, with the gold standard, if you will. Again, that relatively arbitrary number of 100 visits in total. In context to what others have put out there in the literature, right, there's a wide range if we look at just beef for both confinement and grazing, right, from everything from about 30 visits to even on the higher end, one of our publications looking at 70 visits for 2 minutes or greater with the data set that we had from intensive grazing cattle. So we're in the hunt, right? There is that variation, and part of that is, again, probably those different settings that folks have, the different conditions, right? All those factors that are contributors to where you might hit a threshold that's reasonable, right, in terms of actual estimation of a methane phenotype. We've thought about this as visitations, number of days it takes to hit this number. Of course, it varies depending on how frequently the animals actually visit. Typically in our facility, we're going to be definitely averaging over 2 visits per day per animal. So within a typical feed intake test, we can easily hit the 55 visit threshold usually for our animals if we're assessing them at the same time. I know this is small, but also in that publication, we looked at kind of building upon the earlier conversation, thinking about CO2 emissions, oxygen, and then metabolic heat production, since we also have those other analyzers on our units, and thinking about comparing 2 minutes to 3 minutes. The key takeaway here is it actually takes fewer visits if we're thinking about quantifying and hitting that same criteria, right, from a standpoint of methane with those other traits, right? CO2 in particular, right, we start getting to that 0.95 threshold pretty quickly, right? Other work that we've done is looking at animals across different production phases. In here, just sharing some kind of high-level data of thinking about what some of that looks like. And so for us, we think this is important. This is what's unique about, of course, beef production is animals may be moving all over the country. They're exposed to different environments, different diets. And so following some of those animals through those production environments and thinking about how these emissions change, and then as I'll share, thinking about how maybe ranking changes in terms of methane classification across those different environments is really important. So here what we're looking at is a subset of animals that are from the Beef Improvement Center, the 2023 calf crop animals, and what their average as a group was when we think about fed a backgrounding diet and when they were grazing on summer pasture, and then when they came back into the finishing environment, right? I'm not presenting methane yield here, but this is one of those things that we know drops pretty significantly. We've observed that several times of moving from grass or even a high forage diet into a finishing diet. Methane yield in terms of grams per kilogram dry matter intake typically is dropping 40% pretty quickly, right, when we feed that grain-based diet. We do see methane intensity vary quite a bit, right? And of course, these Rouse range animals, great animals in terms of finishing and carcass quality. This was a tough environment, right, for them to live out there on the shortgrass steppe. And so gains went down. And of course, this methane intensity factor reflects that versus when they're in the feed yard eating a high grain diet and meeting their full potential and actually gaining at quite a high rate. So similar to this idea of residual methane, we've looked at this as well. And of course, in the beef context, there's different ways we can calculate residual methane. These data are more thinking about accounting for metabolic bid weight and dry matter intake, right, as our regression factors that we're including here. And so this is another subset of last year's calf crop from these BIC animals that were fed a high forage diet. And if we just look at the high and the low within, again, all a contemporary group, all fed in the same time, same diet, same management, we see pretty substantial differences from this residual methane classification of a 35% difference within that pen. So building on what Francisco shared, right, there's a lot of variation. We see that repeatedly within groups of animals of, even though they're all fed the same diet, they may be from the same ranch of origin. We see this consistent 30% plus variation in methane emissions, whether we're expressing it as grams per head per day or even using some of these residual traits. For us, from a phenotypic standpoint, which is an important clarification, right, especially what we just heard, when we think about our relationship between residual methane emissions and some of these other traits, right, if we think about RFI versus RME from a phenotypic standpoint, for us, it typically is looking like a shotgun blast, right? We don't necessarily see a relationship there. If we think about just methane production in RFI, actually what we have observed is almost a slight negative correlation where those animals that are high methane producers are actually, I'm flipping that around, but the animals that are producing more methane per day, right, are basically producing more per unit of intake, right? Our thought there is, well, maybe that makes sense from an RFI standpoint. If those animals, part of what's being expressed there is they're more efficient at digestion. Maybe there's a higher yield of gas, right, from a fermentation standpoint that's coming from that. But this is something that we're hoping to dig a lot deeper in and understand this beyond just the phenotypic correlations, but getting back to what was presented earlier, genetic correlations. Related to that, though, we have thought about this from a standpoint of, since we have some of these data across production phases in a couple of different years, how can we think about, even just from a phenotypic standpoint, are methane ranks stable, right? Are animals that are low emitters that we observe on grass or in a high forage diet, when we take them to a finishing phase, are they still a high or a low emitter, or do they reclassify themselves? So this is just a summary of a paper that we published last year, looking at 46 Angus steers. When they came into the finishing phase, half of them were implanted, half were not. And we classified them in different ways, just on methane production, methane yield, methane intensity, and then using this residual methane, which was, again, with our metabolic body weight and our dry matter intake. We used our criteria of only those animals with 55 visits or greater that we actually included in this analysis based on that first paper. And then again, looked at how proportionally these animals changed from a standpoint of between backgrounding and finishing between the different phases. So really the takeaway here is this chart highlighting the proportion of animals that actually maintain their category based on those different variables, right? So working from left to right, methane P is methane production, methane yield, methane intensity, and then the residual methane emissions, right? And highlighting here the two different basically environmental factors of either those animals that were given a terminal implant or not in that case, in the finishing phase. So ultimately, between 35 to 83% of these animals re-ranked, depending on the classification, depending on the implant status of these animals. So it's not a very, very stable situation if we just think about a scatter plot from a standpoint of methane emissions during the backgrounding phase on the x-axis and methane during the finishing phase on the y-axis. We have our two different populations of implanted and non-implanted. Our correlation coefficients or Spearman rank correlation coefficients, I guess you could say maybe they're moderate, right? I don't know if that's something to get too excited about. I'm not a geneticist, right? For me, that seems pretty low, and that those animals are relatively re-ranking quite a bit when we go from one production environment to another, again, from a phenotypic standpoint. Other things that we have done is building upon the comment that's been made a few times of thinking about what are other things that we could use this gas flux data for. And this is I would say almost more of a pilot scale study of thinking about, can we predict feed intake from animals using CO2 flux specifically and other growth performance variables. So what we did in an aggregate way is we looked at some of this data where we have known dry matter intake, known growth performance, and the gas flux all simultaneously measured from these 130 steers fed a high forage backgrounding diet. We looked at different equations from the literature and then also tried to develop 2 prediction equations and then cross-validated that against an independent data set from the University of Florida where they were measuring intake and gas flux independently as well. And in terms of how those models performed, I'll share a little bit more on the next slide, right? But we have kind of a wide range here in terms of our prediction ability, right? And if we use CCC as kind of our key criteria, I'll go to the next slide here. One of the models that we developed, which is this M7 model, and I've put the equation here, had a concordance correlation coefficient of about 0.73, right? So decent, not bad, right, of just using CO2 flux to try to predict dry matter intake. At the same time, this is a very small data set. We need to actually replicate this and really figure out how widely used this could be. But as has been mentioned, right, there's a lot of opportunities there if we think about grazing animals where it's very hard for us to actually measure feed intake, or if we're in a group house situation, right, hopefully a cheaper way to try to estimate intake rather than using feed bunks or other alternative uses, right, another use case for gas flux. I'm also going to share some of the data from Dr. Schilling-Hazlitt, newly Dr. Schilling-Hazlitt, some of her PhD work. So we've also looked at comparing cattle of different breeds. In this case, we compared Brahman animals versus Angus-type Bos Taurus animals with different technology regimes. So as you're looking at this graphic here, to kind of think about what this is showing is we had 2 different groups of 100 Bos Taurus animals, 100 Bos Indicus animals in a summer run of this experiment. This was repeated twice. Some of those animals, half, were given all the production technologies that are available to us, right? So think of everything that we can possibly do, implanted, reimplanted, given Tylen, given Rumensin, and given a beta agonist at the end of their life, versus animals that were basically never ever cattle, naturally fed cattle, no technologies, right, in both cases. So kind of a 2x2 factorial of looking at the impact of both the breed and the technology use. I'm just going to focus in on the second phase. As you look at this timeline, these animals were fed in 10 head pens in a replicated randomized complete block design, and then also brought into our facility the last half of that finishing phase in the 180 days. So the takeaway, or the key data from a gas flux standpoint, are here from that last phase of production. So there's a lot of rows here in terms of all these dependent variables, but some of the key things are things that we would expect, right, from a standpoint of particularly our species effect of comparing Bos Taurus and Bos Indicus animals, right? If we think about our average daily gain, right, in terms of having a higher on average rate of gain for our Bos Taurus cattle compared to Bos Indicus. Interestingly, for our methane emissions expressed as grams per day, we do see quite a big difference there in terms of less methane coming from those Bos Indicus animals compared to Bos Taurus. That should be somewhat expected also based on the intake differences, right? And so when we kind of normalize our methane emissions per unit of dry matter intake, right, that difference is there, but less pronounced, right? But there's still, in this group of cattle, we saw this reduction in methane emissions per unit of intake. Importantly, though, are these last 2, and as we talked about earlier, and I think Matt brought this up, of thinking about what is the right way to express methane, right? We have all these different expressions. If we're going to think about efficiency, or we're going to think about relating it back to some sort of profitability metric, right, methane normalized to either live weight gain or some sort of function of carcass gain may be the most important for us, right, to think about from this standpoint. And really the summary there is on this slide. If we think about what those impacts are, not surprisingly, right, we have this difference between the two species, but also growth promoting technologies work, right? There's a reason why we use them. They improve the efficiency of growth, and they lead to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, or particularly enteric methane emissions per unit of gain, right? And that happened in both of those different subspecies. We've also looked at the impact of a terminal implant on some of these purebred Angus animals from the Rouse Ranch, looking at a study where we had either implanted or non-implanted animals. This was 62 head total, and they were either half of them were implanted for 52 days before slaughter or 80 days before their slaughter date. And so as you look at this data here, right, again, we can joke, right, this is not exactly too groundbreaking, but implants work, right? They increase the efficiency of gain, they increase our final weight, right? Even a terminal implant late in the feeding period of these animals. From that standpoint, we also saw an increase in feed intake for these animals that would be expected with the smart feeds. We've just started digging into this with some of our data, trying to think about feeding behavior metrics we can add to these analyses. And so with this data set, right, we looked at how many meals per day did these animals actually have, with no difference there from a standpoint of treatment. But we did see this slight tendency for those animals that were implanted to basically eat a little bit more in every meal that they were up there at the bunks actually eating. And building upon that, if we look at the gas flux data with this set of animals as well, we see a interaction for many of these terms in terms of the days on feed between the 52 and the 80 days prior to the end of slaughter and the implant. Key thing here, if we think about methane emissions, right, we saw for these longer fed animals, if you will, or longer fed with that terminal implant, an increase in methane emissions. And this is probably somewhat reflective of that reality that we had higher intake, right, for those animals. Not sharing the overtime data, but we saw in those last few weeks after the implant that divergence there between control and the implant intake, and that's really reflected in methane emissions. Methane intensity, again, if we're going to say this is maybe more important in general, right, we saw this reduction in methane intensity by giving the implant. However, there's a little bit of attenuation of that effect when we think about the fact that those animals ate more, right? So they're kind of offsetting some of that benefit, if you will, from a standpoint of reducing methane emissions per unit of live weight gain. And then kind of finally, when we think about some of this, we're also interested in this bigger picture conversation about greenhouse gas emissions, sustainability, right? A lot of this has led to goals that folks have, whether it's industry goals or corporations having goals and looking into Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And part of that is modeling and trying to estimate how many emissions are coming from different phases of production. And enteric methane for beef, that's a big chunk of it, right? It's over half of the carbon footprint. So we want to understand how accurate and precise those existing models are that may actually be feeding into life cycle assessments or other estimates of Scope 3 emissions from companies and from different supply chains. So for this experiment, we combined data from 5 different experiments, 448 steers, and again, we're using that 55 visit threshold here. Dr. Juan Vargas dug through the literature and pulled out 72 prediction equations for enteric methane. So there's a whole host of choices you can make, right, in terms of when you want to predict methane emissions. So here's kind of the summary of that, right? Okay, we're going to plot all 72 of those emissions. We're going to say, how well do these emissions compare to actual observations for finishing cattle? Okay, so as you look at this chart, the height of each one of these bars relates back to the root mean square prediction error percent, and then the dots relate to the concordance correlation coefficient. So even in our best case scenario, right, we're not that great, right, at predicting methane emissions, at least back to this observed data set that we have, right? So for us, that tells us we probably need to do a lot more work in terms of better understanding our finishing cattle methane emissions. For us, getting more of a variation in our diets. But this creates a good example of why we need to keep collecting this data and keep evaluating and improving models as well, because there's big industry implications of this if we're using models that don't do a very good job of estimating the mean or the variation. And this is also from that publication, just looking at plotting here the proportion of these models of all 72 of these, how many of them were either under-predicting or over-predicting, right? So we see a larger proportion of those models that actually under-predicted methane emissions from those finishing cattle, right? If I were to go back a couple of slides, what's important here is, I didn't really call this out, but if we think about methane emissions as a percent of gross energy intake from this one study here, and we've seen this a few times, while we may say feedlot cattle are somewhere around 3% of energy loss, gross energy loss, we've consistently seen this to be a little bit higher, right? So back to all these discussions that we've had about, is there potential there for improving energetic efficiency, right? Can we get any of these mCals that are being lost per day into the atmosphere as methane back into the animal from a net energy perspective? And I think that relationship there makes sense why we see more of these as under-predicted, right? Just because we're observing higher gross energy losses. So just in summary, kind of pulling all this together, for us, this individual animal data collection has been really important, right? For answering a lot of these questions and doing it in an environment that's more commercially relevant, right? Which is key. We're not restricting animal intake, we're not restricting animal behavior, and we're able to actually collect this data, and that's very, very important. The variability across animals managed similarly, I think this has been a repeat theme, is kind of amazing, right? How much variation there are within pens of animals, within groups or cohorts of animals that are managed similarly, fed the same diet, right? And so that's where we're definitely excited as well as a group, and it's really encouraging to see all the work that's being done across the country on genetic selection and across the world on genetic selection. For us, we're also interested in these ideas of what else can we do with this gas flux data, right? The question that was asked earlier by Pat, would you want, different VFA basically? Maybe, right? That might be an interesting way to think about rumen fermentation, right? So there's other things that maybe we should be thinking about of how we can use this gas flux data. This one, we're often not, we joke, we're not going to win a Nobel Prize when we give animals implants. We're like, wow, man, these animals gained more weight. This is incredible, right? Methane per unit of gain went down, right? But at the same time, I think this is important work to reinforce how important those technologies are and to kind of challenge some of our assumptions of how should we best express methane emissions and think about that and communicate that back again to the industry that's making goals, right? Often in absolute terms, should we be pushing more for things that are intensity based? For the enteric methane prediction models, we're starting to increase how much diet diversity we have, and that part is really important, right? If we want to make more robust prediction models or approaches. And so for us, our future and ongoing work is looking more at those dietary ingredients, dietary formulations, trying to improve models. We're also dabbling in the rumen microbiome space, but for us, just getting started, hopefully going to hire somebody. So if you have some young person that's really good in microbiome, please send them our way, right? And we hope to be really pushing in that area in earnest, doing a lot of the same things that everybody else has talked about with the buccal sampling and linking that up with fecal, etc., the whole thing. All right, so thank you. Happy to take any questions if I have time. And again, thank you very much for the invitation.